Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We'll be getting started in a moment. First, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items. We're recording today's webinar and we'll be making that available to you tomorrow morning just in case you'd like to watch it again or share it with any of your colleagues. If you have any questions over the course of the presentation, please put them in the questions panel in your GoToWebinar box, and we'll be sure to answer them after the demonstration. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce our presenters today. Timothy Edgar will be kicking off our session today. Tim is a former national security and intelligence official, cybersecurity expert, privacy lawyer, civil liberties activist, and a Virtru privacy advisor. We've also got Brett Dorr, Director of Solutions Engineering here at Virtru. Today, Tim and Brett will be covering GDPR data protection considerations for email and file sharing to help prepare you, especially if you are considering or have already moved to the cloud. Okay, I think we're all set. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you very much, Emily. So I'm going to start. Can we get to the first? Thank you. I'm just going to start to talk about GDPR and who it affects because it's different from current EU data protection rules. Then discuss a little bit about what counts as personal data under GDPR, and the short answer is practically everything, but we'll go over that. We'll go over the penalties of non-compliance, which is really one of the big differences between GDPR and the current regime for privacy in Europe. We'll talk a little bit about the Privacy Shield. That's the arrangement that the U.S. government has negotiated with the Europeans to try to offer alternatives to companies. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the shortcomings or weaknesses of the Privacy Shield, as well as, what you need to do when it comes to the Privacy Shield. And then we'll just get down to the brass tacks of what email, how this affects email and why that's important. Because we don't necessarily always think about email when we're thinking about GDPR. And then some key protection considerations for data. So that's a broad overview. Then I'll kick it over to Brett in order to talk about how Virtru's capabilities can help you. So just getting started with GDPR overview. Basically, it's the main framework for protecting EU citizen personal information. So that would be all the 27 members of the EU, as well as 3 other countries, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, that are members of the European Economic Area. I'll talk a little bit about what we should be concerned about when it comes to Brexit and why you should be worried about GDPR even beyond Europe. But some of the key points here are that it covers all entities that are doing business in those countries, the 27 EU countries and the 3 others that I mentioned. And it's going to enter into force in May of 2018, so that's coming up pretty soon. My impression is that companies, although they're aware of this deadline, may not be aware of just how significant it is, and they're, like anything else in life, scrambling to meet it. And then the fines are very considerable. We'll go over those in a little bit more detail, but the largest fine is up to 4% of annual turnover, which is roughly equivalent to the revenue from your entire global enterprise, although it might even be broader than that. So let's go over a little bit more who GDPR affects. So this is a new part of the rule that broadens it considerably. As I mentioned, all companies or entities who are doing business or offering goods or services or who monitor behavior in any of those countries are going to be covered by GDPR. It says specifically those who offer goods or services whether or not for payment. So if you're offering digital services to EU members in the EU or these other countries, you're covered. And then if you monitor behavior, which is not really fully defined, but clearly is trying to get at the idea of companies that are collecting data or receiving data and using it to monitor behavior without necessarily themselves offering goods or services. This is a lot more organizations than are covered arguably under the existing EU data protection rules. Those rules applied to people who had, or entities or companies that had an establishment in the EU. And so there was some litigation around what did that mean, what counted as having an establishment in the EU. And that gave companies a little bit of an out or an argument that even though they may offer certain goods and services or monitor some behavior, they didn't have an establishment. You don't have that out anymore. Basically, this is saying, no, you're covered as long as you're dealing with EU citizen data. And then another key point here is that the EU's data protection rules are very influential worldwide. They don't just, they themselves apply only in Europe and the EU countries, but many other countries, more than 100, actually model their data protection laws and their privacy laws on EU data protection laws. And so we think that, even if you're doing business in some other country in Asia or Africa or Latin America, it's quite possible that they've adopted a GDPR or EU style level of protection. And it applies both to data controllers and data processors. So those are terms of art in the regulation. The controller is essentially the company that's interfacing with the personal data, maybe collecting it or using it. It's their customers. The data processor is the one doing the processing and handling that data. And obviously those might be the same entity, but they might not. So I put here at the bottom of this slide a basic point. If I don't do business in Europe or handle the personal data of EU citizens, should I still care about GDPR? And the answer is simple yes. If you're doing any business abroad, there's a good chance that some country that you're dealing with is following the EU model. So, this is actually a fairly simple question. What does GDPR consider to be personal data? The answer is basically everything. I've listed some obvious ones here, like name, photo, email address, IP address, clearly identifiable to a person. There's really no argument here. Banking or other personal information, medical information, social networking posts. But the key point here is this one at the bottom. Any data that can be used to identify a person. So that's not just direct identifiers, what we think of as being obvious direct identifiers, but indirect identifiers, things that can be used to identify down to the person. And research continues to expand that category. Privacy research continues to show how information that seems to have been stripped of its identifiers can still be re-identified. And so a lot of data that you may not think of as being personally identifiable will count as personally identifiable under GDPR. What happens if it's ignored? So here are the top fines. 20 million euros or 4% of annual turnover, that's whichever is greater. And even for the not as blatant or flagrant fines, you've got up to 2% of annual turnover. So that is a serious, serious penalty, and that was deliberately put in place by the Europeans because they felt that their privacy rules weren't being taken seriously enough. There was actually a fair amount of debate and discussion during the past decade and a half or so about why is it that American companies and other companies doing business in Europe are seeming to give only lip service to these privacy rules, and some companies were very frank and said, well, we'd rather just worry about paying the fines. They're not that high, and we have a lot of business and personal data. And so the Europeans decided to send a real signal by increasing these penalties to a much more dramatic level in order to force companies like Facebook and others that seem to be thumbing their nose at EU data protection rules, saying, well, is this going to get your attention? So, obviously we don't know yet exactly how those will be applied, but they wanted to give regulators that big stick in order to send a signal in the most egregious cases. So I want to talk a little bit about the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield is an arrangement that the U.S. government, the Department of Commerce, has made with the European Union, and it's designed to serve as an alternative to directly complying with the GDPR. The idea here is that if you're an American company, you can work with the Commerce Department to make a bunch of promises to protect personal data and to adhere to certain privacy principles. If you do that, you get the protection of the privacy shield. You're no longer essentially directly under the GDPR, but the U.S. government has promised to enforce those privacy commitments and promises you make to protect personal data through the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. So my basic question here is, do I still have to worry about GDPR if I've signed up to the Privacy Shield? And the answer is essentially yes. You're still making commitments to protect personal data and privacy. And here's the key point. Those commitments have to provide essentially equivalent protections for privacy and personal data as if you were complying with the GDPR itself. If they don't, then Privacy Shield will be struck down by the EU Court of Justice. And that may happen anyway. It may be that the Privacy Shield arrangement is currently being challenged in court in Europe, and it's quite possible, I think actually quite likely, that the European Union's Court of Justice is going to strike it down because they're going to say it's not offering essentially equivalent protection. If that happens, which would probably occur sometime late next year, you will be way ahead of the game if you're already compliant with GDPR. But even if it doesn't, the point is that you're still having to make a lot of the same privacy promises. And so you're much better off if you're basically complying with the spirit of GDPR, even if you don't have to comply with every last provision of it. So one key question here is, what does GDPR specifically say about email? And the short answer to this is it doesn't really say anything about email specifically, but there are several key provisions that make it clear not only that email is, of course, if it has personal data, has to be protected under GDPR, but also that there are specific requirements that regulators are going to look to see if you're taking seriously your obligations to protect personal data. So I've divided these into three different areas. One is risk-based email and cloud encryption, privacy by design and by default, and then the many references to state-of-the-art security. So this is going through very specific provisions of GDPR. It's quite a lengthy regulation, 200-300 pages long, so I've picked out some of the ones that I think are most relevant here. But here's a key point. Controllers and processors have to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. So this is sort of risk-based security. And it references encryption of personal data as an important protection that may be needed in order to address risk. So this is a key point. The question is, when you look at the risks that you as an organization face, and you realize the sensitive nature of a lot of the personal data that's in your email, is it appropriate to encrypt it or to forgo encryption? And I would argue that the regulators are going to look at that, and in a lot of cases they're going to say, there's a lot of risk here, and encryption is not so hard. This is something you really needed to have done. So that's point number one. Point number two here is the strong emphasis on privacy by design and by default. The idea here is that you don't just look at it afterwards and say, okay, we've got a lot of sensitive data, what are we doing to protect it? When you're designing your system, you're supposed to be designing it in a way that's privacy friendly and that allows a lot of these protections to be running in the background by default. And when we get to Brett's point, he'll show you how this is true with a lot of the features Virtru offers, but that includes things like making sure you collect only the amount of personal data you need, and then how they're protected while they're being stored, how long they're being stored, who can access them. So these are things you need to think about ahead of time as you set up your system. And certainly email is a critical system that you need to be thinking about, and these are all critical issues in setting up an email system. And then the final point here is that security measures are supposed to take into account the state of the art, and this is true for encryption as well. And there is a key a factor here that we think is quite relevant. There's a European Union Agency for Information and Network Security, and they did a report back in 2014 that describes the state of the art for email encryption and basically says, well, the state-of-the-art for email encryption is end-to-end security, and that was 3 years before GDPR. Now, that statement isn't part of the regulation, but we think it's going to be influential for EU regulators as they think about what does it mean to have state-of-the-art security in 2018. And certainly this can be relevant that their own information protection agency 4 years earlier said, well, that means encrypting your email. So Virtru can help with all of these. We're going to talk a little bit more about in detail about them, but obviously it encrypts email and file attachments with a very simple, easy-to-use swipe system. It also has a lot of different features for key management. So, you can control your keys. You can have Virtru control your keys. This is something that your company and your organization can figure out based on your needs and what's best for security. And then access controls, very, very sophisticated access controls that are easy to use and allow you to set permissions for particular types of files or emails in ways that are going to be easier for your customers to use. And then I haven't talked a lot about the audit capabilities that are required by GDPR, but GDPR is all about putting in place responsible officials, designated officials in your organization that have a plan for collecting and processing personal data that's done in accordance with the way the rules allow, and that protect it. And then, of course, in order to make sure that those rules are being followed, there has to be audits, and there has to be the ability first to do those audits, and then you have to actually do them. So Virtru gives you a lot of capabilities that allow you to audit where your personal information is, who has access to it, if there are any problems with how it's been shared.
Thanks so much, Tim. So it's fantastic to have a summary of some very complicated or in-depth regulations as they occur here. As you understand GDPR, there really aren't specific prescribed applications of technology, as Tim has mentioned with this. So Tim has done a fantastic job trying to map some practical applications of where your data resides and how that sits, and based off of the recommendations and regulations associated with those. And that's really where Virtru comes in these mappings. So what we're going to go through briefly here is break down these 4 areas of encryption through audit, describe some of the specific areas and applications of that, then go through a brief demonstration to show how Virtru will help with each of these 4 areas. So we'll begin at its core with encryption. So specifically how Virtru helps with encryption is providing end-to-end encryption. But before we describe what that is, let's differentiate some of your different options for encryption. By and large, most of our communications will hopefully be encrypted as they go from server to server as it goes to email. This is done through technologies that basically run the internet from a protected communication standpoint using TLS or SSL-based encryption between mail servers. So in this case, the content itself isn't necessarily encrypted at the client. It's not necessarily encrypted at the server level. However, it's encrypted in transit, so the connections between those, protecting any eavesdroppers in between as we have that. So while this offers some fantastic abilities to protect eavesdropping, there isn't an inherent nature of the content being protected in and of itself. Another approach is to use a server-based or portal-based type of encryption technology where you will upload your email content to be shared externally, thus introducing a third-party provider into the equation where now your most sensitive data that you are protecting under GDPR regulations, and now you need to transition or transfer that risk to that provider to protect that content. So you aren't inherently in control of the information, who has access, and the encryption keys associated with that. So this is the major reason why Virtru's end-to-end encryption is very applicable to GDPR, not only to state-of-the-art mechanisms, but also it helps you control the other three areas between key management, access control, and audit, ensuring that only authorized parties are able to access your content. So going on to key management, there aren't any specific recommendations again towards key management as we have that. So specific to key management as a whole, really you need to be thinking about, as I include encryption technologies and handling that, it's also really important to consider the practices and controls of those keys. Because as we think about encryption technologies, you also need to consider, well, who has access to keys? Where are those stored? Are they accessible to third parties, which maybe give control of that content as we have that? So here's a quick quote from Gartner from a great paper from Steve Riley, really indicating that encrypting content is one aspect of this, but the most important aspect is actually how you manage and control those keys. So in the context of Virtru, by default, we provide a very easy-to-use solution that allows, that really reduces the burden of that key management from you as a whole, as an organization. But we also give you the flexibility to provide your own customer key services to ensure that no unauthorized parties even have access to those encryption keys. And how we do this is we do this through a customer key server that you can host inside of your environment, inside of your servers, or a cloud service provider of your choice with that. In reality, as this maps to GDPR directly, from a privacy protected provider from a service provider perspective, this ensures that any of the service providers in between, your Office 365, your G Suite system, your encryption providers for your cloud storage, none of those have access to the keys. So Virtru offers a variety of options, from a software as a service to customer key servers to a hybrid approach to storage of encryption keys. But at the end of the day, part of a state-of-the-art system involves complex access controls as well as the auditing and ability of that. And we're discussing access controls and the use of data protection. One of the key areas that we will consider is no system is 100% secure, as we recognize that, as recognized by the GDPR. So as we have any potential data breaches or fear of data breaches, providing the ability to withdraw consent, truly revoke access to content that has been shared via email is an important aspect and maps directly to this, as well as if we have identified a potential data breach, whether on purpose or by accident, being able to notify access policies and controls of that and revoking access. This also directly relates to the concept of the right to be forgotten. As we get those requests, as we identify content that is in our emails and email system, truly revoking access to third parties or any recipients or senders of that content. But this also deals with retention and expiration, controlling the data that has originated in your systems and has moved outside into recipients that are outside of your domain, being able to enforce expiration of content and the disable of forwarding become critical aspects to consider throughout these regulations. And the final, and sometimes the most important piece, is proving that you have the ability to audit the access control of your most sensitive content. So demonstrating to the regulators throughout these exercises that truly only authorized parties have access to the content, and going above and beyond that, being able to prove have they then thus forwarded it on. So the concepts of emails are inherently content that is being shared both outside of your organization and can potentially be reshared, with the concepts of forwarding emails or replying to all or going through that process. So this becomes very difficult to manage without additional protections or layers of protection on this technology that will track the forwarding and handling of this. So of these four areas, Virtru has specific offerings and technologies to help you with encryption, flexible option with key management, the ability to provide access controls, revoke access at any time, and then provide audits of those. But what makes Virtru different is the question. And at the end of the day, Virtru, we focus our technology on very easy sharing. That is a very core tenet of Virtu's technology, is providing the ability that really gets that it is easy to apply encryption technologies from an IT perspective, but the people that are handling our most sensitive data aren't necessarily technology experts. They're not computer scientists. They're not we're not going to put complicated key management technologies in front of them. So being able to provide both end-to-end encryption without creating boundaries on that is a very important aspect of the technology. And at the end of the day, it's not just about providing encryption technology, data protection technology, but pervasive control across your systems as we go through this. So these are all very conceptual in nature, and I think really the best way to understand Virtru is to just briefly see how our data protection technology works, both from the administrative protection and understanding your control capabilities, but also from the user perspective to understand we aren't getting in the way of your daily workflow. We want to complement that by providing an extra layer of protection. What we're going to do now is going to step through a brief demonstration. As Emily mentioned during the introduction, we'll be taking questions right after this demonstration. So be happy if you have any questions for Tim or myself, just pop up the panel, the GoToMeeting panel, and put the question in the chat panel. Okay, so at its core, Virtru provides you data protection technology, and we surface this through our dashboard into our control center that allows you to understand the emails that have been sent and the attachments that have been sent with layers of protection on them. So as we view this, we have the ability as an administrator to understand the emails that we've sent. Have they contained possible sensitive information? When Virtru protection has been applied, you can understand if emails have been accessed. We have read receipts associated with the emails. You can see if these emails have been forwarded to other parties. And you as an administrator, if any of these conditions don't meet your regulations or you need to change policies with this, you can immediately revoke access or introduce expirations or other capabilities within that. Along with those capabilities from a control standpoint and an audit standpoint, you also have the ability to define what rules and when Virtru protection should be applied to your content. So as we look at this environment, as we have this, you can define what patterns, as Tim mentioned, pretty much anything personally identifiable can be viewed or seen as GDPR. So as we see this, or under GDPR regulations, this may include IP addresses or credit card numbers or just possibly sensitive information, maybe keywords associated with data as I have that, or partners that I'm communicating to. But at the end of the day, the Virtru protection solution allows you to define custom rules based off of patterns of data. In this case, we've got a national identifier for our Spanish citizens, what actions we want to take on those users. These are all administrative capabilities that you can enforce from a DLP rule standpoint that says you need to be applying additional layers of protection based off of our applications of policies and procedures. So from the sender standpoint, these are great from an administration capabilities, but we want to make this as seamless as possible from the sender and the recipient standpoint. So if my senders are in their email client, in this case in Outlook, what Virtru provides is we provide capabilities that will allow you to hook into the native experience and directly choose to protect information by turning Virtru protection on, or based off of those rules, have our users warned or automatically protect content based off of those rules that we've set up earlier in the dashboard. So when we apply these rules, as we have this, you can choose to send securely, and when you send those messages securely, now you have that additional layer, that end-to-end encryption based off of that. So what that looks like from a recipient standpoint is directly inside of your email clients. Again, I'll just switch to a webmail client in this case and show what it looks like to receive one of those. So before we were in our Outlook client where Virtru provides a native hook into your Outlook experience. We are also the recommended partner for encryption based off of the G Suite environment as well. So when you send emails as you go through this, you have the ability to access emails as we go, natively decrypt those environments within your native email client as we have. Additionally, you're not required, though, we cannot require your senders or your recipients to have Virtru protection or to have one of our clients installed, because those recipients may not have the ability to install additional clients inside of their browsers, inside of their Outlook sessions. So what Virtru does is provide seamless protection for those users as well. By sending them an introduction message of why you are receiving this encrypted message, those are all customizable to you as the sender, to the emails as we have that. But you have the ability to unlock those messages directly in there and decrypt directly in our secure reader after you're authenticating yourself as a user. The authentication step will use the native authentication to your email provider if that's available directly in there, but you'll also be able to securely reply to these messages, including attachments within there without ever installing a Virtru client. All of these are critical functionalities as we have. So at the end of the day, as we consider GDPR in our environment, as we consider this, Virtru is offering that additional layer of encryption technology that provides end-to-end encryption for your emails, allowing you to audit access and protect and control the information as we have. And at the end of the day, it's all about understanding, as you've identified, what are your communication mechanisms in your storage, how do you add additional layers of protection for that. So we're going to jump into the questions and answers section here. As mentioned before, feel free to pop a question in for our Tim or myself, and we'll be happy to answer now. So I'll hand it over to Emily.
All right. Thank you very much. We do have a couple questions. The UK ICO suggests that browser fingerprints and other stealth tracking should be classed as personal data. What are your thoughts? And I think this is a good one for Tim.
Sure. Well, it really comes down to whether you think that these technologies can identify a person and how difficult it is to do so. If they can easily identify a person, I think that would be correct. It's personally identifiable. But it also just sort of underscores that there's a lot of information out there that you may not think of as being personally identifiable that in fact will be seen as personally identifiable. The other key point I didn't touch on in the main presentation is about the UK, and that is that even though the UK is leaving the EU, they have already, they're members now, and they've said that they're basically going to comply with GDPR after they leave. So you're going to have to deal with GDPR in the UK even after they're no longer a member of the European Union, and that just points out just how influential those data protection and privacy rules are throughout the world. I've said before that it's a little bit like, they're going to set the standard worldwide for privacy and data protection for any major company because it's easier to just adhere to the highest standard of any jurisdiction than it is to try to design different systems for different standards. Just the way that car manufacturers will design their cars to meet the highest emission standards of any state. A lot of companies are going to be designing their systems to meet the highest standards of privacy protection in the world, and those are going to be the EU.
Great, thank you. We've got another question. GDPR uses the term data subjects, and because personal data is defined as any data used to identify a person, companies must be concerned of processes and encrypting employee payroll as well, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. We were talking this morning mainly about the things that Virtru can help with, but obviously there's going to have to be, you have to look at all of your data holdings and figure out what you need to do to comply. And so some of those are systems that are going to be other systems. So we're not we're not a solution that's going to provide, one-stop shopping for all your GDPR needs, but we do think we have some capabilities that are going to help with a lot of those needs.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Let me see. There is a break in questions right now. If anybody has any questions, please put them in your questions panel. I'm going to launch a poll if that's okay.
Sure, Emily. I just had a couple other things to chime in on that I noticed when Brett was talking. A couple things. One is that, those different levels of security that Brett was talking about, which rules you decide to set and how you set them, I think are really well designed to deal with the fact that GDPR is very descriptive. It has a lot of things you have to do. You have to go through and figure out your data and how you're using it and what lawful grounds you have to collect and process it. But it doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. And so different organizations are going to find, based on their plans for protecting data, they're going to adopt different approaches. And one thing that I like about Virtru is that it allows you to set these different rules and to have different approaches for protecting privacy that's based on the risk that you've identified. And that's really the key sort of concept behind GDPR is requiring companies to manage their data and to make an assessment of the risk that they think their data presents in terms of privacy protection. And the other key thing that I thought about when Brett was describing the revocation features of Virtru, the ability to revoke and say, okay, I don't want people to have access to this string of emails or this particular set of data, is that, he mentioned the right to be forgotten. This is an important concept in EU data protection law, the idea that sometimes after some period of time has passed, that data is no longer relevant and that you as a data subject have a right to that data basically being eliminated. And a lot of people have been scratching their heads wondering, well, how in the world can you actually do this? Maybe it's a great idea, but is it practical? And I think Virtru really helps make that idea practical by giving people the ability to revoke data in a way that you don't have before. And not just the right to be forgotten, but also the concept of consent is very important here because you have to give really meaningful consent to your data being processed, which is going to give people in Europe a lot more control over their data than they have, for example, in the United States. And that consent also has to be revocable. You have to be able to give your consent and then at some time decide, well, I'm not using your service anymore. I no longer want to consent to you using my data. And I don't see how without having some kind of revocation feature, you're going to be able to make that meaningful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I've got another question just rolled in here. How important is data location for GDPR? If data is encrypted, does it need to be located in a specific place?
I'll take that. I think that's a great question. I think the answer there is there isn't any specific data location requirements, but if you transfer personal data outside of the EU under GDPR and even under existing rules, you're only allowed to do that to a jurisdiction that has adequate protection for personal data. That means you have to have essentially equivalent protections to EU data protection rules. That's what the Privacy Shield was designed to address. That's also a reason why these rules are so influential worldwide, because many countries are finding that the easiest thing to do is to just adopt a data protection and privacy regime like Europe's. Then they become a jurisdiction where it's okay to transfer data. If your data is encrypted, then there are certain advantages that you have. And one of those advantages is that it doesn't count anymore as that encrypted ciphertext isn't personally identifiable without also having the encryption key. So it gives you a little more flexibility as to where your data is stored because what EU regulators are going to be concerned about is who has access to the personally identifiable information, and that has to do with where who has access to those keys. So, that's kind of a long answer, but essentially it all comes down to data protection. It all comes down to making sure that personal data is not given to, a country where they don't have the same level of privacy protection. And encryption can be very helpful in giving you more flexibility in terms of data storage.
Great, thank you. I do have another question. What about when the U.S. tries to access data in an AWS or Azure data center that is not within the U.S. jurisdiction?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's necessarily, there's a question embedded in there about the physical storage of data. And in this case, as the regulations are going through, it's not necessarily where physically you're storing that, but it's how and the protections you're putting in place associated with those. So as we're looking at this, we're thinking about data protection of your elements and the levels of protection you're providing, assuring only authorized parties access that content, as opposed to the physical location of those zeros and ones within that. So the physical location of the storage isn't as much of concern in this case.
So I would just point out just a broad point here, which is that there's a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how GDPR is going to be interpreted and applied, and data location is one of those areas where the law is rapidly shifting. The point of having a service like Virtru is to give you more control and security when it comes to data that you have stored in the cloud, whether that's Amazon or any other cloud service. If you have those data stored in an encrypted form and you know where your keys are located and you're comfortable, your lawyers or your CISO is comfortable that your keys are either stored on premises or with Virtru or however you've decided to do it, it just gives you a lot more control because we don't know. We couldn't tell you, and I don't think anyone could tell you exactly how these legal debates over data location are gonna play out. But certainly, if the data is encrypted and stored on the cloud only in encrypted form and can't be accessed except with certain keys that you know where they are, you're going to be much better off.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question. I've heard that some companies are required to appoint a data protection officer. Does this apply to everyone?
So the answer to that is no, but it does apply to larger companies as well as companies that are processing more sensitive data. And the idea here is that every company is going to have someone that's responsible for compliance and figuring out how to protect the privacy of their customers and the data, protect the data. The larger companies are going to have a designated protection officer. And so that's the kind of official that makes a lot of sense to interact with Virtru or other service providers to say, okay, we've done an inventory of our data, we figured out what our risks are, and these are the rules that we want to apply. So some of those rules Brett was going through, showing you how you can set up your system in a certain way to warn you about certain kinds of data. The data protection officer at a larger company would be exactly the right person to be administering that. And then at smaller companies, we'll work with you to figure out a package that makes some kind of sense for your organization based on the risk profile. But it's all about identifying, this GDPR is all about identifying people within an organization who are going to be responsible for data and then can be held accountable for it. And that also has to do with the audit as well, making sure that the enforcement of these rules are necessary. One thing we talked about was ease of use is really critical here because spending money on consultants or buying fancy software isn't going to help anybody comply with GDPR if you don't use it. So it's going to be very important that not only that you have the right capabilities or you buy the right software to protect your data, but that your employees and others are actually using that in the way that you want them to be using it.
Okay, great. We do have a Virtru question, so I will shoot this one at Brett. How does Virtru support email archiving and e-discovery?
Great question. So really it comes down to the different email archiving solutions that you may have. In some instances, we'll have direct integration into those email archiving systems that allow you to perform privacy-preserving encrypted search without showing that content or those search strings to the e-discovery provider. We also provide technologies that will allow you, based off of your requirements or regulations, to decrypt directly before they're inserted into those systems, or we provide bulk tools that will allow for decryption based off your e-discovery needs. So really, when we're discussing e-discovery and archiving systems, it really comes down to what are your processes, your policies, as well as your regulatory environment that is required for your processes. So depending on those answers, will provide various levels of technology to provide access to that content, since that is indeed your corporate content, not something that Virtru is owning in that case.
Okay, great. I do have one more question that's Virtru related. Can an administrator revoke messages on behalf of their users?
Absolutely. That is a key feature or functionality of Virtu's technology is the administrators are in control of those encryption keys just as the senders are as well. Those encryption keys are owned by the organization and can be protected in various manners as we discussed before, but at the end of the day, you as an administrator can revoke access to those keys, ensuring the appropriate protection of your corporate data.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time, but before everybody goes, I do have a couple of polling questions I would just like to launch here. So I'll just give you guys a moment. We'd love to know what you thought of the talk and how relevant this was to your organization. We will just give you another moment to fill in an answer here. And while I'm doing that, I'll let you guys know, Brett, if you can move the next slide up, we will be sending out our GDPR guide to data protection, considerations for email and file sharing, along with the recording of today's presentation. So you'll be getting that first thing tomorrow morning, just in case you'd like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues. Okay, I'm just going to show the results back. It looks like this was very relevant, or at least somewhat relevant to most of you, so this is excellent. Thank you. And just in case any of you would actually like to have one of our experts reach out to you, I've got one more poll here, so let us know if you'd like a team member of ours to reach out to discuss your needs further. And I'll just give you a moment. And thanks again to Brett and Tim for the great presentation and their time today, and to all of you for attending. Okay, I think we're all set. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Emily.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all.